Well, we're going to return to our look at American Presbyterian history today, and we're going to consider and get into the 19th century of Presbyterian history in as much detail as we can. And in a lot of ways, this century was the golden age of Presbyterianism, and that's how Sean Lucas describes this section in his book that I mentioned when we were last together. And we'll talk about some of why that is. But a lot of things happen in this century. But before we get to that, just throw up our timeline as it exists. We've already talked about kind of the prehistory of the Reformation in the 1600s, and then we started our history in 1706 with the first presbytery meeting in the American colonies. That was in the city of Philadelphia. We talked about how the church grew in the following decade, and they were able to establish the first synod, which is a collection of presbyteries, and they continued to grow. Then we looked at how there was a subscription controversy that took place in 1721 to 1729, where there's debate about how we are to subscribe to the Westminster Standards and what that looks like, how is that implemented. And there was a lot of that went on and happened during that time. At the same time, there's this great awakening that's happening that is also causing some ripple effects throughout the colonies, of course, but also within the Presbyterian context, with the subscription controversy happening, with the Great Awakening that is sweeping across all the churches and all the colonies. There are some sides that are taken, and that is the first split that happened in the church in 1740. I think it's 41, actually. 1741, where you have the old side and the new side. The old side, those ministers who were skeptical of the Great Awakening and did not appreciate some of the practices that were happening by those itinerant revival preachers. The new side were those who really embraced the awakening. And we have figures on the new side like Gilbert Tennant, we've mentioned him before, who was an associate of George Whitefield and who was familiar with folks like Jonathan Edwards during that time as well. So there's a split that happens, old side and new side. That split is thankfully resolved in 1758. And from there, the church is more or less unified as it goes through the rest of the 18th century. And what we're going to do in this class is pick back up now with the next major event that takes place, which is 1789, which is the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America. So we're going to pick up there today, and we're going to slow things down a little bit. We went through that first class very quickly, the history of it. And of course, the best laid plans, they never work out with a snow day and with my own traveling and a lot of upcoming events that we have. Our classes are going to be a little sporadic. So I'm hoping to cover all of the 19th century, some of it today and some of it next week. Then the week after that, we have our congregational meeting on the 23rd. Then we'll have Sunday school after that week. Then after that is our installation service and fellowship meal, so we won't have Sunday school. Then we will have Sunday school. Then we won't have Sunday school because it's Easter. And then after Easter, I hope that we'll have some uninterrupted weeks to finish up the class material. So that's the plan. A little sporadic. But if you miss any classes or if you want to listen back to anything, need a refresher, we are recording these and we're uploading them to our main sermon podcast feed for our church. And you can search for CTK Joplin on whatever podcast app you use. Or if you go to our website, go to the resources and click on sermons, you can find links to all of that on there. And it's also on the emails that get sent out on Mondays. So you can find links to stuff on there as well. All right, so that's a lot of housekeeping and a little review. So let's look at the year 1789. The new Book of Church Order, with a revised confession of faith that removed some of the language about the civil magistrate ordering religious affairs. This new Book of Church Order was crafted, developed, and then adopted by the Synod of New York and Philadelphia in 1788. The Synod of New York and Philadelphia was the result of this reunion, where you have the old side Synod of Philadelphia and the new side Synod of New York reaching an agreement to join and reunite back together. And now the church continues to grow, and they're in need now of a general assembly above the synods, above the presbyteries, above the local congregations. So this synod adopts this new Book of Church Order that establishes a general assembly. So they adopted in the year 1788, and by adopting that, that means that there's now a general assembly that will meet the next year, 1789. And this general assembly met in Philadelphia, only 4 blocks away from the U.S. Continental Convention that was meeting at the same time. So these things are happening at the same time. In 1789, there's 177 ministers that are serving 400 churches that are organized within 16 presbyteries that are then have 4 synods above those presbyteries, and then at the top is this general assembly overseeing all of it. So much has happened in less than 100 years. From here we have 7 ministers, and now we have 177 across all these different churches. So incredible growth is taking place. It is worth noting the difference, though, between the American context and the roots in Scotland and over in the British Isles. In Scotland, it was an act of Parliament that established the Church of Scotland, and it had established the General Assembly, and then church life worked its way from the top down into the presbyteries to the local churches. In the American context, it was the opposite, but everything was built from the bottom up. It began with local ministers at local congregations that then established themselves as a presbytery, and then as a synod, which then adopts the confessions of faith. And it's only after the church continues to grow, as congregations and presbyteries are added, as more synods are needed, that then a general assembly is established at the top. So, in other words, the American Presbyterian Church has, in many ways, always been a grassroots church or institution. And that's talked about a lot even today in the PCA that we belong to. Oftentimes we'll talk about how we are a grassroots denomination because it's from the bottom up. That's part of our history. So we have this General Assembly in 1789. Who's the moderator of this first General Assembly? Well, it's a name that I'm sure you're familiar with. John Witherspoon is the moderator. He's given this honor. So I'm sure you know from history class, you know the name John Witherspoon, because not only is he important in American Presbyterian history, he's important in just American history in general. Witherspoon was a Scot. He was educated at the University of Edinburgh and also in St. Andrews. He's better known perhaps as one of our founding fathers, as a signer of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Not too much longer after that we're here at our date, 1789. But what was the reason why this Scotsman came to the Americas, came to the colonies? He came in the first place to be and serve as the president of the College of New Jersey, which would become Princeton College. And he came over in 1768 to serve as the president of Princeton. So we're talking about this date, but we do need to jump back just a little bit to talk about this college that's happening here. So we need to discuss Princeton because the school and the faculty are so important for our discussion of the 19th century. So Princeton started off as the College of New Jersey in 1746, which makes it one of the oldest higher education institutions in the colonies after Harvard and William and Mary and Yale. And then there's also the College of New Jersey. If you remember from our last class together, many of the new side Presbyterians, part of the reason the old side were suspicious of them is because they're being educated by William Tennant Sr.'s log college, which was a college that was on his own property in a log house where he was training ministers by himself and some of his sons, Gilbert Tennant being one of those sons who would be very influential. Well, many of the trustees and the people who would go on to form the College of New Jersey were these New Side Presbyterians. And those people were committed, to academic excellence, but also a true, warm piety, a warm experimental piety. If you remember, a lot of the discussion was, we want to see some religious affections. We want to see some Christian character, some religious experience that you're having. So they cared about both of those things. The first president of this college, a man named Jonathan Dixon, he opened the school in 1746 in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, with around 10 students. So very humble beginnings. But he died within 5 months of the opening. And this would prove to be a pattern for most of the early presidents of Princeton. So after he died, another pastor, Aaron Burr, maybe you're familiar with that name, was asked to take over leadership of the school. And he was in Newark, New Jersey, so the students moved over there and studied under Burr. In 1748, the first class, there were 6 men graduated from this college. 5 of them became Presbyterian ministers, and one of them became a Continental Congressman, Richard Stockton, who served New Jersey, and he was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So you can see right away, this school is having some major influence in the colonies and in the birth of this new nation. In 1752, Aaron Burr marries Esther Edwards, who's the daughter of Jonathan Edwards. And under Burr's leadership, the college grew and acquired property in Princeton, New Jersey. And the trustees of the college, they're getting ready to move to Princeton. They need some funding to build some buildings there. So they send Gilbert Tennant, I mentioned him. He's one of the Newsiders. He's one of the Log College men. They send him and another young pastor, Samuel Davies, who's very influential during this time period as well. These Presbyterian ministers, they send them to Britain to raise funds for building this new permanent campus in Princeton. And they were able to receive the funds that they needed. So in 1756, NASA Hall is completed. And it's spelled NASA Hall was built, and it receives its name in honor of King William, who was from the house of NASA. This building became a vital place, a vital part of America's history. So I'm quoting here from some of the history that you can look up your own on Princeton's page. You can read all this history as well. But during the American Revolution, when Princeton's campus became a battleground, NASA Hall was ravaged by the occupying troops of both armies. The Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, marked a turning point in the war when the British troops holding NASA Hall surrendered to George Washington. In 1783, the building served as the nation's capital, housing the Continental Congress from June to November, and it was in NASA Hall that the news of the peace treaty with Great Britain was received. So much of American history is happening right here on this young Presbyterian school's campus. So when NASA Hall opened in 1756, there were 70 students in that year, 1756. But the following year, Aaron Burr passed away at the age of 41. And within a few months, so did his wife, Esther, a very young age as well. She passed away. This was Jonathan Edwards' daughter. So the college is now looking for their third president, and they decide to ask Esther's father, Jonathan Edwards, to be president. And he was chosen, and he served as the third president of Princeton. Yet, it would only be 3 months later after that he would die and pass away. So now the college is in search for their fourth president, and they decide to ask the young Samuel Davies. And he had previously gone on that fundraising trip to Britain, and he now is returning, and he's serving as the president there. He's a very young pastor at this time as well, and he's debating whether or not to do this because he cares so much about the church, and he wants to stay a preacher in many ways, but he understands that he's going to be doing the work of training ministers for the church, so he does go and become the president. And that is 1759 when he becomes president. But, unfortunately, he also passes away 18 months later. So he was able to stay in the role a little bit longer than his predecessors, but still, he died much too soon. And then another Samuel Finley, he's also a Log College New Side graduate. He serves as the fifth president. He's able to stay the longest so far, but even his tenure is cut short. He's able to stay in service as president for 5 years, but then he also passes away while serving as president in 1766. So the college at this point is just desperate for some long-lasting, some longevity in their leadership. What's that?
Healthy.
Yes, yeah. We need some young, healthy. Well, the thing is, I mean, some of those guys were very young and healthy, but it's just the period of time and just everything that they went through. Well, exactly, and that's part of it too. It was becoming a reputation that this is a. I'm not serving as a president of a college, but of a cemetery. But that brings us back to Witherspoon. So Witherspoon, they're searching for someone to really bring some leadership to this college, long-lasting leadership. And Witherspoon at this point in time has already become a leader in the Church of Scotland, and he's well known in the colonies because of some of his published work, and very well respected. So one historian describes Witherspoon like this. He says, his impressive Scottish education, ministry experience, piety, and orthodoxy inclined the trustees to think he could be a most useful bridge builder in America between the former Old Side and New Side parties. So in Witherspoon, you get the total package. He's part of this emphasis on revival and Christian piety, yet he's a very strong academic mind. He cares a lot about education. He's Scottish, which means that he does have that Scottish orthodoxy found in the Westminster Standard. So he appeals to both sides that still exist within the church. So the trustees, they're able to get their man. They bring him to Princeton in 1768. So that's what brings Witherspoon here. And in Witherspoon, they did receive the longevity that they were looking for. He served as president for 25 years, and he oversaw, it's remarkable what he saw over his tenure there. Close to 500 students will graduate from Princeton during his tenure. Among these students, President James Madison, one of his students, Vice President Aaron Burr, Jr., who was son of the former President Aaron Burr, Sr., known for his famous duel with Hamilton, but he's also a graduate of Princeton. And then listen to the rest of that's recorded here. These are graduates from this time. 12 members of the Continental Congress, 5 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, 49 U.S. representatives, 28 senators, and 3 Supreme Court justices are all going to graduate from Princeton during those 25 years of his tenure. But let's not forget that this is an institution that was created for ministers of the gospel. So this college also trained many ministers during Witherspoon's tenure. 114 new ministers would graduate during this time as well, and 19 of those would also go on to become presidents of other higher learning institutions. So that's John Witherspoon, and that brings us then to, we're still not quite here at this date, okay? But we do need to skip past unfortunately for time, we need to skip past the War for Independence. But I hope that you've received just a taste of how influential the Presbyterian Church was in the founding of our nation during this time in history. And they were huge. The Presbyterian Church was very, very involved in the Revolutionary War. We do need to skip over this period. We need to get into the 1800s, but there's a few quotes that I just think are so wonderful that give you some taste and give us some color of how this war, and especially the Presbyterians' involvement in the war, how it was perceived. Presbyterians, this is one historian says, Presbyterians almost universally supported separation from Britain, earning them the reputation of being a primary culprit behind the American Rebellion. Many of Washington's troops were Scots-Irish. Many of them were Presbyterian. So listen to a few of these quotes. So these are quotes from other soldiers on the Loyalist side or on Britain's side. So this is an Englishman. He's writing in New York in 1776, and he writes this: Presbyterianism is really at the bottom of this whole conspiracy, has supplied it with vigor, and will never rest till something is decided upon it. So that's his experience with the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. There's an unnamed New England Loyalist who, in this time period, also called the Scots-Irish, quote, the most God-provoking Democrats on this side of hell. That was his experience. And then a German Hessian officer who, they were, England had been employing some of the Germans to fight for them as well. So this officer wrote home in 1788. He wrote home and he said, call this war by whatever name you may, only call it not an American rebellion. It is nothing more or less than a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian rebellion. So the moral of the story is, if you like your freedom, thank a Presbyterian. That's the moral of the story. All right, well, we do need to jump ahead in our story, though. As the country became independent, the American Presbyterian Church is also growing and becoming more fully grown, and is now organized from the bottom up into a full church, as a full General Assembly across the whole nation as it existed at that time. And now we're ready to move into the 19th century. But right away, we're going to see that there's more tensions and trials and turmoil that is going to spring up upon the church. And right away, we see this happening. So we're moving on in our timeline here. Right away, in 1801, there is an act that's adopted by the General Assembly that's called the Plan of Union. So this new nation is growing rapidly, and right around the turn of the century, we have this westward expansion that begins in earnest. And of course, most notably, that's the Louisiana Purchase. That's 1803. But even before that, many people are moving west, and they're settling in the countries there. And there's just not enough pastors to go around. There's not enough ministers to go around in all these, not even in the original colonies, let alone all this westward expansion that's taking place. So even before 1803 and that Louisiana Purchase that brought a lot of settlers west, even before that, the churches are already feeling desperate to get more ministers ordained and sent out into the field. So in 1801, something of great importance happens that affects the rest of the trajectory of the American Presbyterian Church, that ultimately would be a point and a catalyst for another division that we'll look at in a little bit. That was the Plan of Union in 1801. This Plan of Union was a plan between the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. And their plan was that they would unite, they would be in unison together in their efforts to supply ministers to these congregations who needed them. So if you remember, there is some shared history between the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists. They had a very shared Calvinistic and Reformed background dating back to the Reformation, all the way back into England. The Congregationalists were springing up from the Reformation happening over there. And because of their some of their shared theological beliefs, even though they differed on matters of church polity, the Presbyterians had a structure of elders or presbyters at various levels of authority. The congregational churches were independent of one another. Even though they had those differences, they tried to come up with a workable solution. So what was this plan? Basically, it was an agreement where churches in need of a minister, whether it was a congregational church or a Presbyterian church, they could call a minister from either of those denominations, either of those churches. A congregational church could call a Presbyterian minister, and a Presbyterian church could call a congregational minister if they wanted to and if it was needed. And those congregations and ministers would be recognized in both local presbyteries and synods, as well as the congregationalist equivalent of those things, which were some associations that they had. So Sean Lucas in his book provides a very helpful summary of this plan, his plan of union. So under the plan developed by Jonathan Edwards Jr., president of Union College in New York, so he's one of the leaders of this next generation, Jonathan Edwards Sr.'s son. It says, each denomination promised to, quote, promote mutual forbearance and a spirit of accommodation toward each other, particularly in each local congregation that might be constituted from both Presbyterian and congregational elements. The plan provided means for adjudicating disputes between congregational churches that desired to call Presbyterian ministers and vice versa, either by referring the matter to the appropriate association or presbytery that held the minister's ordination credentials, or by creating a joint committee made up of Congregationalists and Presbyterians to rule on the matter. The plan also provided an avenue for churches with mixed sympathies to join as a united congregation, that is, people of both Congregational and Presbyterians in the same congregation, and they would exercise discipline of church members by creating a session of ruling elders. Members under discipline had the right to appeal either to presbytery or to the congregation. And finally, the plan potentially gave Congregationalist leaders the same right to sit and act in the presbytery as a ruling elder of the Presbyterian Church. And if you're confused about some of that, well, that's part and parcel of the problem. That it was a very strenuous kind of plan from the very beginning. And no doubt this plan was adopted and put into effect with good intentions. We need ministers to reach and to provide care for these churches. But even from the summary, you can tell there's a lot of moving pieces in there, a lot of potential for misunderstanding, and several points of potential failure. And congregational polity simply is just not Presbyterian polity. And that would prove to be a major point of failure where you have Congregationalist leaders who are not ordained in the Presbyterian Church, yet having a vote within presbyteries and making decisions on Presbyterian matters, including matters of doctrine. So all of this is happening. Add to this growing suspicion from some of the Congregationalists, some of their theology that began to develop in the century. And it turned out that really a lot of their assumed shared theological beliefs really just weren't all that similar anymore. There were some major differences that were coming to light. And all of these issues will come to a head when another revival sweeps across the colonies, and that's what's known as the Second Great Awakening, or the Second so-called Great Awakening. And we will talk about what that is and why that is in a little bit. But so that's all. We're really going to pick that up next week. But I wanted just so you have an idea of where we're going. So we have this Great Awakening that's taking place, and there's going to be some major divisions that are going to happen. Where in 1837, we're going to have another major split. And this is going to be known as the Old School, New School split. And these churches, there's going to be two churches that will eventually become four churches. Because what other major event happens in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century. There's the whole Civil War thing happens. And so the old school, new school churches that exist across the colonies, there's old school churches across all the states and colonies. There's new school churches across the entire country as well. Well, when the Civil War happens, you're going to have splits that take place, north and south, between all these churches. So there's going to be an old school northern church and an old school southern church. And the same is going to happen with the new school, where there's going to be a new school northern church and a new school southern church. So from one church that's going to split to two, it's going to split to four. And then there's going to be different mergers and different realignments that take place across the rest of the century that ultimately is going to bring us into the 20th century, which is where most of our modern day denominations will be formed. So the PCA is formed out of one of the southern old school branches of the church. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church is a branch from the northern church in the 20th century. The PCUSA as it exists today is a reunion in the 1980s of the existing northern and southern liberal churches after groups like the OPC and the PCA left. So that's where we're going. We'll talk about all this. We'll talk about the Civil War. We'll talk about the Great Awakening that takes place during that time. We'll talk about the effects of the old school, new school split. That's where we're going. So just to whet your appetite a little bit there. But we have a little bit of time now for questions or just comments. And so we'll open it up there. And thank you.